Hey everyone, in a previous video in this series, I touched on HTML pages and what makes up an HTML page. I've actually emptied my repositories folder for now, and I'm going to create a new folder, just call it website for now. And I'm going to open this in Visual Studio Code. And I'm going to create some more HTML pages. So I'm just going to start with one called home.html for my home page. And let's say this is going to be a blog. So maybe this is Jamie Barrow's blog. And this will be the home page. And I'll also have a title here to say home. Maybe homepage, so it's the same as what's here. And then I'm just going to have a short message to say welcome to the homepage, take a look around. Hopefully you like what you see. And then I'm also going to have an unordered list of items that have links to other pages. So you'll see most tags in HTML, they either say exactly what they're for. This is the body of the document. And the whole thing is this HTML block. This one's a bit complicated. It explains that this is an HTML document type. It comes from the days where you might have had different types of documents. But these days, everything's basically just HTML5. So this is standard. A lot of browsers, you can even just leave this off, or if you don't have anything in the header, you can probably leave that off. In fact, sometimes you can even leave all of that off and it will just assume this is all the body. But I like to be specific in any case, so I just include everything. I like to be more standard. Makes the browsers, let's say, more consistent, and it's easier, I guess, for them to know, okay, well, you really do mean this is in the body, that should be in the body. But yeah, most element names are either a full word explaining exactly what they are, or they are an abbreviation. And I guess that's because back in the day, you didn't really want to send a lot of data down the wire, so they wanted to shorten things as much as possible. So H1 instead of heading level 1 is an abbreviation. P instead of paragraph, it also might be a bit annoying having to type paragraph every time, it's quite long. So P is just shorter. UL stands for unordered list, and then you also have OL for ordered list. This you'll see, for example, they both have list items, but this will be numbered, and this will just have maybe bullets, a bullet list, and this is a numbered list. So I don't really want numbers, and I don't really want to be fancy. I'm just going to have an unordered list of links. And A actually stands for anchor, so it's like, I don't know exactly why it's called anchor, but I suppose it's a point in a document that you kind of are highlighting is a link to somewhere else. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure why it's called anchor. You can look that up yourself. But if I type this, that text will be picked up by the browser as a reference to another page, usually, or different website, or different URL, uniform resource locator. So this is kind of like a resource reference, and H is like the hyper part. So this is a hypertext reference to another page. So let's say I would have a contact details page, or maybe contact us page. And then I can have a nice text here to say contact us. And then I can do the same for maybe a guest book page where, guests to the website can leave some feedback, or, this is kind of classic what you would have used to see in the past. And maybe about me. And actually, I don't know why I'm saying contact us. Let's say contact details. I'll just make it contacts. Yeah, I think that's better. And I'll make it about me. All right, so that's good. I'm going to have 3 different links in my menu. And now I'm just going to copy and paste this general structure to each of those pages. So I can start building up my website. So in the contacts page, I'm going to update the title and that message to just say, welcome to the contacts. See my details below. And then maybe I'll have like just a div with telephone number and put some random number over here. I don't believe that's a real number. If it is, my apologies. And here we see this tag which is called div, and that's, I suppose, to me it's just a division of the page. You'll see what that means just now, I suppose, if you haven't already. And you also get ones called span. So maybe I'll use this tag to say this is a span of text. It kind of helps the browser know a bit more about the structure of what's in here. Maybe it wouldn't know that this is actually a phone number, but now that it has this kind of way of structuring it a bit more, it could maybe see, okay, this is actually meant to be all together. This is maybe this is a telephone number. So it's kind of trying to add a bit of meaning, also called semantics, to the document. I could have, of course, just put all of this as plain text without marking it up, but that's the whole point of marking it up. We adding meaning to what's in this document. So you'll hear about the semantic web a lot, and it's kind of based around that principle of structured data and meaning around that structures. So I could also even have here an abbreviation. I could say this is actually an abbreviation, and I could put here in the title, I could say telephone. So maybe it'll just show the text here, but maybe there's a nice screen reader or a web browser is trying to figure out web crawler, I mean, like Google or Yahoo or Bing. Maybe it'll see this is the telephone number for my blog and show those details on the search results, for example. There's various ways of marking up to say this is going to be telephone number. And I actually think this isn't really the way that browsers work. There's kind of other metadata that gets added into the document. But in principle, that's exactly how it works. It tries to read the document, understand it, and see, okay, what part is what does this text mean, and how do we show it? How do we display it? Okay, so that's basically me just explaining HTML a bit more and building out the website. So let's go into the last page, which is the guest book. So I'm going to call it guest book and update this. And I'll say, please leave me some feedback below. And in this case, I'm going to have I'll have a form for them to fill in, and maybe guest name, guest email, and a message. So for the name, I guess that'll just be a normal input box. For the email, same thing, but the message will have a text area. And you see now, as I was typing this, it kind of, when I closed text area, it added that closing tag. But with input, I don't need to really close it. In the olden days, when you did have stricter document types like XML and HTML, like version 4, there was more ways of being explicit about how these are closed and if they should all be closed. that maybe this would not be valid XML, but this would, for example. These days, HTML, you don't need to be as explicit anymore. These are kind of equivalent. And because the default type is text, you also don't need to type this. It's just by default a text one. But also with HTML5, you have different inputs, like I think there isn't actually an email input type. And then the browser will maybe autocomplete with your email address if you have let it save your email address, or maybe you'll get a different user experience. You'll get a different keyboard that has the @ symbol for your email and .com and whatever to make it a bit easier to type your email. So that's why these are kind of been introduced, these different types, to allow the browser to know, okay, this is going to be an email input. Let me change my experience for the user to make it easier to use. All right, and I think that's it for now. Let me just open this up in the folder and open up the home page. And you see that this is exactly what I wanted. I can go to my contacts. I can go to the guest book, but actually when I click that, it didn't work. It says here, file not found, which is strange because I have guest book. But you see I got the extension wrong when I copied and pasted. So it should be HTML. I've got HTM, and I'm going to make it consistent and just rename the file. You could, of course, update the link, but I think consistency is quite nice. I'm going to then close this Explorer. I don't need that anymore. And let's finally just add the About page as well for now. So About Me. About Me. And then I'll just say here, I am James. That's all you want to know about me, I suppose, for now. Let's say I am James. I'm a software developer, and I like to share knowledge through YouTube. Okay, and if I go back to the browser and I refresh, perfect. There's only one thing. I want to actually be able to go back to the home page on each page. I don't have a link here. So let me just add that now. And I'm just going to pin these to the side. And I'll just add it to the top. So let's say home. And then I'll just copy and paste that into all the pages so that they are all the same. I don't have clipboard history on, and I cut it, so I lost it. On the home page, I suppose we're already there, so I don't need a link to the home page. Let me just add it anyway and see what it looks like. So now if I refresh, I can go to the home page, I can go to contact details, and I can go back to the home page, and everything is working fine. If I look at the contacts, you see when I hover over the TEL abbreviation, it shows me that little pop-up there saying telephone, which is quite nice. Maybe I'm not English, it's not my native language, and I go over here and I realize, oh, that meant telephone. I didn't realize that that's what that abbreviation meant. So that's also about adding meaning, not just for the browser, but for people using the browser. Okay, and then I think I want to update this look and feel a bit on the guest book. And this comes back to what I was explaining about the division. First, let me add labels actually for these inputs. You see, if I try and click on here, I don't actually go into the text box. So I want to make sure that it's a bit more user-friendly. So I'm going to put these in labels. And you see if I press tab there, it adds the for attribute. And we saw that previously. So I'm just going to call it guest email. And just fix this up quickly. And let me just copy paste might be easier. Message. And I forgot the 4 attributes. Let me add that. And now I need to add the IDs. So I'm just going to use a nice quick tip here. Copy that. It's gonna kind of work. Let me fix this up just now. Maybe it was easier doing something else. All right, so okay, doesn't matter. I've fixed it up now. So now if I click on each one, I get the focus when I click on the label, which is a nicer experience. And I want to make these each on one row. So previously I mentioned the div tag. It's like a divider. So if I put this label here and I refresh, see it puts it on its own line. And I'm actually going to inspect that. If I right click on the element and I inspect it, I get to the Chrome developer tools, and I'm just going to make this window a bit bigger. And you can also, of course, get to that from more tools in this this menu, and say developer tools. You can press Ctrl-Shift-I, and I think sometimes F12 and some other shortcuts work depending on the browser. So if I press Ctrl-Shift-I, or if I press, I thought it was F12. F12 also works. I don't know why it doesn't show my shortcut key for you, but if I press F12, it also shows and hides the developer tools. You can also click this button over here to just select something in the document, and then you see it's updating on the right which one is selected. So if I click on guest name, that's the label, but it's within this division element. And you see it's got some styles here on the side. So this is CSS styles, and it explains how the browser is going to display the page. So for the division elements, it's got this display block, let's say style rule. So the browser knows, okay, I'm going to display this as a block level element. And because it's a block, you see that blue, let's say highlight. That's a block of content that it's going to just put there. And then anything else that comes afterwards will have to come after the block. And then if I click on this input, you'll see, guest name, guest email. These are not actually display block. And see, there's a whole lot of different properties here. You see, it's coming from the user agent style sheet. That basically means it's Chrome's style sheet. Most browsers have the same kind of basic properties that are set. So pretty much every browser would have div as display block. That's just part of the HTML standard. But maybe you had something like a font size, and you can actually go here and see computed styles, and you can say show all, and you can see all the different styles that apply. And you see that the ones that are applying to this one is kind of brighter or more prominent than the rest are faded. But if you look for stuff like font, the font size is 16 pixels by default. So that's kind of the default that is set up in Chrome. So if I look, for example, for display here, we see that for the div it's block. But if I look at inputs, it's also a block, but it's inline. So you see that blue and the yellow and that kind of highlights. That's showing me that it's a block, but it's also inline within this page. If I click on the label, it's not quite like a block. You see like there's a slight difference in what the size of the blue rectangle and the yellow and all of that. And you see it's inline. So it's like a block is going to take up the entire part of the line, and anything that comes after it would be pushed off into the next line. Whereas if it's inline, then it's going to go within the same line. And there's like space around it, but that's around like margins and padding and that kind of thing. I'm not going to go too much into that, but that's basically cascading style sheets, CSS. And that's all of these rules are just styles that are applied. You see like the height and that are automatic. If I look for everything again and I show padding, you see there's not really padding. Margin, there's not really margin, but that's why if I look at this one, we do see some margin being set specifically, but it's actually 0, so it's not really having a margin, but it does have some padding, so that's like some extra space. And you see this is explaining like how these boxes are kind of working. You've got this margin on the outside, then you've got a border, and then you have some kind of space between it, and then you have this padding, and then you have actually what the element is. And you see as I hover over each of these, like the blue one on the left is blue, and it's showing you that specific area. Now you see the green highlight. It's a bit hard to see, but there's a green highlight, that's the padding. The border's in yellow, so that you can see quite clearly. And then there's no margin here, so if there was margin, you would see that highlighted in orange. But that's basically how these are being laid out. So a div is a division, like a block that you can divide the page into. So I'm just going to update the styles here a bit, and let me make this window smaller. I'm going to put each of these on its own line, so I'm going to just make them all within divs. And VS Code and in other editors, you can do a shortcut. So I want, let's say I want 6 divs, so I could say div times 6 and press tab, and now I've got 6 divs. It's called emit in VS Code. It's also called Zen coding, and there's other plugins for it that kind of do the same thing, but it's a nice little trick. So let me actually do that again and say div times 5, press tab, press enter, tab. All right, so now I have kind of some structures and I can just move these around. I'm just gonna drag them into the right place. I know I'm kind of spending quite a lot of time and it might seem slow, but don't worry about that. The best way to learn is going through things in detail quite thoroughly. So if it feels like I'm repeating things as well, that's also quite good, because the more you repeat something, the more you remember it. Okay, but anyway, if I refresh the page, you see I now have guest name, guest email, message, and let me add a button. So I'm going to say div, and within it I want a button. Press tab. And you see that worked. That's actually kind of using a similar syntax to the way CSS works. Basically matches CSS selectors, which we'll get into at one point. But for now, I'll just know it as an easy trick to generate some code. All I did basically was say I want a div element. Inside that div element, that's what this is saying, I want to have a button. And then if I press tab, well, once I've typed it without doing anything else, then it just generates that. If I wanted it to have a CSS class, I could say .btn, of course, while typing it. And now it's added an attribute for the class. If I wanted a label with for, I think there's also ways of doing that. Yeah, there we go. So there's a lot of different tricks you can do with Zen coding or emit, which kind of matches CSS selectors. Because sometimes it is a bit tedious having to type every single thing out manually. Anyway, I've now got a button, but I want it to be a submit button. And as mentioned in a previous video, a form has a method. So I want it to be a post because I'm submitting data, and it'd be an action. So let's say I wanted this to go again to guestbook .html. I'll just do that for now. If I refresh this, I type in the message, press OK. You see it's actually added some validation in there as well. I didn't have to do that. The browser's checking that I put a valid email in, and that's exactly because I had this type email. You can turn that off. You could say, actually, I don't want to validate. I want to say no validate. This form should not validate. And then if I refresh and I try that, then it works. But of course, I'm just going to use that functionality for free without having to implement it myself. And if we try it again, that seemed to be a valid email, even though it seemed weird. So maybe I would want to kind of do my own validation, but we'll get to that bridge when we get there. All right, so now we've got to a point where I can go to the different pages in my website. I can go to the guest book, but when I type in this message, what happens to it? I don't see it actually being saved. How do I even save it? Where should I show messages? Maybe let me add that to this page. I think it would be a nice experience to see the messages we have already, and then afterwards have a way for a guest to leave their own message. So I'm going to maybe update some wording here. Welcome to the guest book. View messages from our past guests below. I'll leave that for now, and I'll just say leave your own message if you'd like as well. Let me just refresh and see what that looks like. Okay, cool. And then I'll just put an example of a message. So let's say I had here a message, and I had maybe I would have the same labels. So let's just copy those. I have those 3 labels. Let's see what that looks like. Of course, I want it to maybe each be on different lines. So I should have probably kept all of those divs. Let me just do that. So I want to keep the label. This, I don't want it to be an input. Well, let me just refresh. I don't need this button anymore. And these don't need to be inputs. They can just be the message themselves. So I think I'll just make them all paragraphs. And if it's paragraph, I'm just going to close it for now. And of course, there should only be one field with the ID. So I'm going to remove the IDs from these and the types that aren't relevant anymore. But actually what I might do is make these classes. So I'll say this is going to be a class. And for classes, I'm going to use like dashes instead of underscores. Let me do that just to make it a bit more clear that it's a class and not an ID. That way it's a bit easier to know, okay, this is actually the guest email, this is the message. And that'll also let me style them differently depending on what they are. Okay, so let's say my name was Bob at bob.bob, and Bob. Again, apologies if that's a real email address. I really don't believe it should be, so let me know if it is, and I can always censor this. Let's assume it's not. Okay, there we go. So I've got my first message, and maybe I want to have this having a different style. So I'm going to put some inline styles here, and I can say I want this to have a border. It's going to have 1 pixel border, which will be black with a solid line. So that's how you would have a border on an element. And this is actually shorthand CSS. So I can also put this in a style tag here and just type it like this, but you need to have something like a class. So I'm going to have guestbook entry as a CSS class and add that here. And then I can just change it to guestbook entry. If I refresh, I get the same thing. But now maybe let me add some padding, which you remember from earlier is the space around this this box. If I say padding 1 pixel, you see it moved slightly. If I make it 4 pixels, it moves slightly more. And let me make it maybe 8 pixels. Okay, that's pretty cool. I'm going to keep it like that. But I see as well at the bottom, it's quite close to this form. I want some space between them. And that's where margin comes in. So I could say margin bottom is going to be, let's say 8 pixels to start off with. Let's try that. I mean, that looks nice. If I make it 16 pixels, if I double that, that's also quite nice. And maybe I actually want it to be the same size as the text. Like this is kind of the same size as that G or the capital M. And actually there is from typing, from the printing press days, you have units called M's, which is the size of a capital M, I think. So I could say I want it to be 1M. And it's kind of about the same. If I make it double the font size, that's also kind of cool. If I make it 1.5 times the font size, that's also quite nice. And then the thing is, if I change the font size, this will also change accordingly. So this is relative to the size of the font. If I change my base font size to, let's say, 24 pixels, this space will then adjust accordingly, which is quite nice. It keeps some kind of design principles around ratios and aspect ratios. So in general, it's kind of better to use these relative units. Okay, but don't worry too much if that's a bit of an information overload. That's just a bit of CSS that I'm showing you. And actually, it's nice sometimes to just link that into a style sheet. I think it's style sheet. And I'm going to say styles.css. And if I move this then into a new file called styles.css, and I remove this, and I refresh, it still works. And you see, if I go to the network, it's loading my style sheet separately to my document. So now I can kind of just focus on what's in the document. I don't have to have that cluttering up my code. I can just worry about what the content is. And also, if I hardly ever change the styles, then I don't need to change this file. I can just download the style sheet, cache it, and if it never changes, it never has to download it again, which is quite nice. If multiple pages then use the same styles, they can just link to the style sheet. I don't have to copy and paste it in every single page. I just need to copy the link into each page, so that they all get the website styles. So for example, if I wanted to make headings, maybe I wanted them to be underlined. I could say text decoration underline. Now if I go here, I see it works on the guest book and it works on the home page, and I get that kind of for free by doing it once. It's common to all the different pages. Okay, so that's the advantage of CSS. You can have a style sheet. You can share these styles across multiple pages, and you can make your website start to look a bit more professional, have a better user experience, and really start customizing it. Maybe I don't want it to be underlined, but I want the headings to be a different color. So let me just say that the color should be blue. Now in Visual Studio Code, it gives you a nice tool here to choose the color. So I'm just going to choose, I don't know, that seems like a nice blue, and so on. If I wanted to change the body's background color to, let me just start with blue, and then just to see if there's a nice color for the background. Let me make it a lighter blue, so maybe like this, and see what happens. Okay, I don't really like it, but you know, it's a start. You get the point of how it works. What about some kind of really light orange or something? Let's see, brown. Okay, maybe I'd rather have like a dark brown. Let's see, dark brown. That's quite dark. Maybe too dark. Let me make it lighter. No, I don't really like this. Anyway, it's fine. I'll just stick back to the blue color and a white background, and I'll come and make it look pretty later. This is just an intro to CSS and cascading style sheets. We've got a bit more knowledge about HTML. Let's now focus. Oh wait, before I do that, let me first finish what I was saying. This is a shorthand notation. So border 1 black solid is actually a shortcut for border width 1 pixel, and then border color black, and border style solid. So you can either have it all in one line like this and save some typing and some data, make the style sheet a bit smaller in size, more compact to read, or you can style each one independently. You see here, for example, I only needed to declare the margin for the bottom. There's also margin top, right, left, and there's a shorthand version of that, which works kind of similarly to how this border works. Okay, so that's the last thing on CSS. Let's get back to the guest book. And I mentioned, how will we get this to actually save? How will we've now got a way to show them. And actually, maybe I should have 2 on the page. Let me see what that looks like. If I have 2 on the page, that looks fine for now. It'll do. How would I actually add a new one? I mean, I suppose I could have something that's going to update this file every time. That's one way of doing it. Or I could read these from a database and put them into a database somewhere and then read them from the database. But how do I do that at all? Because if I look here, it just goes to this file. This file doesn't have any code in it. How does that actually work? You might say, is that where JavaScript comes in? But not really. That's not really where JavaScript comes in. You can do this without JavaScript. But what you do need is a server, a web server. So in order to execute some kind of code or read a file, save a file, normally this is done on a server, a web server that is hosting your content. Now in Windows, you can set up a web server by going to Windows Features. You can turn them on or off. And again, you can also get to this from the control panel, programs and features. It does take a bit of time, the first start after you've restarted your computer. And you see there's this one called Internet Information Services. Now if I expand that, there's a whole lot of things in here. There's FTP server and all these other things, and I don't even know what all of these different things are for. Not all of them at least. But what I do is I just click on this Internet Information Services at the top, and you see some things are checked completely, but most of them have like a strike through it because it's partially selected. So I don't need FTP server. I need an ability to manage the web server, and I also need the actual web server with its services. So there's application development features, and you see none of them are actually turned on right now. At one point we're going to use ASP.NET perhaps if we're using .NET, but classic ASP is what kind of most people started on back in the day, and like PHP and that kind of thing. So I'll try and enable that for now. But you don't need that to just have a website, so I'll actually turn it off. Let me actually cancel this and start that again so I can just undo that a bit. So let me only select this one. And again, there's all these other things selected. I'm going to ignore that none of the application development features are selected. I just want a plain website for now, and we'll get to that later. And you see there's some common features like a default document, directory browsing, and you see if I hover over it, it explains a bit. It allows clients to see the contents of a directory on your web server, what happens when there's errors, how do we serve static content. That's exactly what we want right now. And then there's other stuff like logging and performance features, security, and these are all important. So like request filtering is the one that's on by default. I'm just going to leave the default for now and leave it up to you to discover the rest later. Maybe I go into a bit more depth, for example, the application development features. But for now, all you need is IIS installed. So let's click OK and wait for that to finish.